ready to go run.
Oh, I hope you didn't get stuck somewhere.
No, I called my friend, got really bad as I got in the car, and let's see what it did. Over there, in the car. And I told somebody online, I said, "Get up, don't hold my braille." And it kind of lasted into the morning. I had to go to it.
Well, this rain coming in this morning, I thought, oh, I'm really good. I took some Tylenol last night, so no, I'll be okay. Well, right now, it's a little bit there, but it's not enough. It's not bad. But David should have it. He left yesterday afternoon and drove the tower, and then stayed all night with his brother, and then drove back today. And then tomorrow it's going to St. John's. Henderson.
I was more excited.
Henderson's East Texas, isn't it?
So, yeah.
Like,
Well, the stops on the 59.
so he's needless to say, he's tired.
Almost wearing Eddie colors.
And probably hamburger. This is more burger.
Yes,
Just
but they were just
thought it was too red for her. That's a deal.
Which is really color.
I hope so.
Well, when they went to your Sunday to go to lunch, Lynn said pray for her because they were going out to the lake.
Oh, and she must have drove.
Sue's driving, yeah.
Well, Sue likes it to be driving.
Yeah.
But she's kind of like David. She's got a little bit of motion sickness. So if she's not driving, she sometimes has a little bit of issues. But I'm not sure I would let her drive. Linda's just gonna have to put her foot down. And Linda can do that. Well,
Bill tried.
yeah. Her husband tried real hard, and it just didn't work.
No, it's just like Bill place.
He's finished his story.
Finish this. Okay.
And they were married for so many years.
Well, so I will say this, if I start doing something wrong, they're gonna know. So this never did that. It was just like, he'll tell me later in the car. See,
Bill and Sue, they married, they were a little older. And she got pregnant. But it was a tubal baby.
Oh, yeah.
And they did a total hysterectomy.
Well, yeah, they used to do that.
We have a box store that Ted, his company, Ted, one of the others, I said, comes here with some are privacy, some are not.
What are they?
They're a replacement door knobs, so one I think where you're supposed to come with this. The new doors, yeah. These are all the interior doors. Oh, so that yeah, only seven. Oh, wow. Somebody mentioned that the ladies' room, one of the locks wasn't folded.
Yes.
Yeah, that's causing a structure play. Instead of them, I've moved them up and down. We just brought us a whole new set. So all of those out. Yes, and I forget, for some reason I blanked on whether we had doors in the baptistries or not. So I'm not sure if we have enough problem or not. But that's better. That's me. So he's a mirror. Yeah, he's
an elder. He's an elder.
He's the one that comes with Jim Kersey. Who's on the front. Cameron and his wife.
When your son did you do?
Well, we weren't here Sunday.
Okay. Was it the same couple that was here?
Yes.
The week before? Okay.
Were they here 2 weeks now? No, they've been here, but it's not. They're still not regular visitors. Yes. He's got dark but gray hair, shorter glasses. His wife's got
sure he's here by now, although he might have been working later. So. And show you the card. Account.
We're gonna talk to him.
He was here briefly. He came in late, did the Lord's Supper, and he left.
I can't.
After worship. Uh, anyway. Right. All right, we're ready to start then. Well, we're in, I believe it's lesson 5 in the Psalms book. And today, actually, it's kind of interesting. Well, it's not that they aren't interesting, but this one I found particularly interesting. Because this lesson we're talking about the Psalms in the context of the history of Israel, and how Israel's history and Israel's story is told throughout the Psalms. It's kind of, and I'll talk about this a little bit in, I guess, in my invitation section. But we talked a little bit about, we've had this conversation a couple of times. Why do we study the history of Israel, and why do we study the United Kingdom, divided kingdom, and Genesis, and all these other things? And it occurs to me as I'm reading the Psalms that if we didn't understand that, we wouldn't understand the Psalms, because there's so much that takes place and so much that is written about in the Psalms that is directly related to the events that we read about in Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, and on even really throughout David's time, obviously. And what it does for us is that, I've mentioned this before, the historical accounts in the Bible are not really intended to be instructional. I mean, they are, but not in the same way. They're basically, this is what happened, this is what happened. And we're not really told in many cases how people felt about that or what the application was in that or what we're supposed to get out of it. But so it's interesting to see when you read the Psalms and you see looking back, the inspired psalmist looking at these stories, and you start to see, okay, that's what we were supposed to understand. And that's the message that was supposed to come through there. And so we really get, and as I was looking at this, and I'm going to walk us through it a little bit. We'll look at some of the questions first, but I'm going to walk us through book 4 of the Psalms. If you remember, book 4 goes from Psalm 90 through Psalm 106. I can't remember which one. I think 107. And it's interesting to me. It seems as if this idea of the history of the people of Israel is very much emphasized in that section. And there's a theme that I think goes through there that I found kind of interesting as I was looking at some of the passages today. But so I want to look at this a little bit, and we'll kind of work through some of the questions that were asked. Um, and one of the things I was going to ask first of all, well, here's what I was going to say first of all. Psalm 102. Look over Psalm 102 real quick. This is I mentioned that there is, hey Dan, I mentioned that there is kind of a theme that runs through these books. And it seems like there's a point that is made in Psalm 102 that really sums a lot of it up. I need a bigger podium. I need a bigger lectern or whatever it is. Um, he's reading through and he's talking about his affliction, and we'll talk about this in the context of all of these Psalms, but this idea of seeking God and taking courage in verse 12, where he says, "But you, O Lord, are enthroned forever. You are remembered throughout all generations. You will arise and have pity on Zion. It is time to favor her. The appointed time has come. For your servants hold her stones dear and have pity on her dust. Nations will fear the name of the Lord." And he goes on and talks about this idea of God revisiting Zion. And he says in verse 18, "Let this be recorded for a generation to come, so that a people yet to be created may praise the Lord. That he looked down from his holy height from heaven. The Lord looked at the earth to hear the groans of the prisoners, to set free those who were doomed to die, that they may declare in Zion the name of the Lord, in Jerusalem his praise, when people gather together in kingdoms to worship the Lord." And it occurs to me that we ask some of the questions. Why does God allow His people to go through turmoil and difficulty, and why doesn't God make it easier for His people? And of course, a lot of that is that God's people made it difficult on themselves. It was their lack of faith that caused most of the issues. But one of the things that the psalmist writes down, and it's exactly what we've been talking about. Why are we studying this? He says, because we need to have this recorded so that people who are coming later will read this and will be motivated to praise God as we are praising God. And it just kind of reminded me of something that I think a lot of people sometimes fail to understand about the Bible and about God's relationship and how it's described. When God calls for us to worship and to believe to believe, how does He typically want us to come to that faith? How are we supposed to have faith in God?
Well, Romans 10:17 says that we
Okay.
develop our faith by hearing.
Okay. Okay. By hearing the word.
That was not exactly the same way in the Old Testament.
Okay.
See things also.
Okay.
We see things too,
Okay.
but they would read the law and practice in this way,
Hmm.
and when they lived it, because they were told to write it on their doorposts,
Yeah.
fingers, and around their arms,
Hmm.
so a constant reminder of the Lord's grace and the Lord's.
Okay. Okay.
When it's immersive like that, and you're teaching it and you're saying those words every day, then your children will.
Okay. David, what are you gonna say?
Also about evidence.
Hmm.
Sam Matthews.
Okay.
Learn to have faith in a creator who goes, look around, we can't do this.
Yeah.
There's no man that can build a tree.
Hmm. Yeah. Try as we might.
Let me see a tree.
Mhm.
Plant a tree.
If we do, it's plastic and doesn't smell like it's supposed to, and all those things. Um, although it doesn't shed on the carpet, so there's that. And I think that's it. We think about the Old Testament, we think about the miracles and the miraculous things that they saw, but the reality is that the story of the Old Testament is God acting dramatically and powerfully for a brief period of time for a specific group of people to establish something and then backing off and having years where really the only way I'm going to have faith in God is to believe what was testified about Him from those before me and to remember that. And that's the idea. And what you start to say, and to go along with what you were saying as well, it's the idea that I will look at what I can observe around me, and I will look at what people before me have said, and I will believe that, and I will believe God. It's the idea of faith. Why faith is so important, and why God continues to put mankind in a position where there's no way I'm going to be able to come to God without faith.
Some way of writing, we are left false.
Hmm.
Who got our eyes?
Right.
All of the attractions. And look at it and say, okay, well, here's how they worship.
Mhm.
And here's how God wants to be worshipped.
Hmm.
So have evidences of that.
Hmm.
It gets like.
Yeah. And it goes back to, I think you can see the wisdom of this because it's like everything. Well, why didn't God do this? And why didn't God be more specific? And why didn't God be more clear? And you can just keep going up the line. Well, yeah, but He could have been clearer. Yeah, He could have been more. And you get to the point where for us to have faith that God would verify for us, Jesus would have had to come and continually die and be raised over and over and over and over again. And the I think the wisdom of God says we can't even go down that road. This has to be about faith, or it's not going to work at all. And so this idea, and I think that's in a lot of ways. I see this thread going through from is it 89 or 90 through this section of the Psalms. This idea of pointing back to God's creation, pointing back to what He has done for Israel, and then painting a not so flattering picture of what Israel has done in return. Somebody's made this point before. What nation that invented a God would paint themselves as the bad guy in that situation? That would say, God is great and wonderful. We're horrible. The reason that we fail is because it's not because our God failed us, it's because we failed God. That's just not how human nature typically works. And yet that's the story of the Bible. It's certainly the story of the Old Testament. God's people continually falling away, seemingly incapable of serving God, uh, falling not just into lackadaisical, but outright immorality.
Well, you know, when you look at the story of the Exodus, how
Mhm.
many days was it just parted the sea
Mhm.
across?
Yeah.
That they said, "Mommy, put
Yeah,
that."
yeah, the history of of people that consider themselves special in some way in the world is not, hey, look how bad we were. It's all the things that we're better at than everybody else. The Bible story is very much the opposite of that, and so it's interesting to see how that comes out, and and again that's emphasized a lot in this section. So as we're looking at these some of these questions, and I'm kind of I guess encompassing a lot of the different questions all together, but just asking you, what are some of the characters and stories that we read about in the Psalms? And some that you may have come across, or you may just happen to remember some that are mentioned in the Psalms. Okay. Okay. Yeah, the flood's mentioned. In fact, it's mentioned in a number of places. The one that kind of jumped out at me, in fact, the one that one of the Psalms that really kind of caught my eye a lot was in Psalm 104, which I found kind of interesting. In Psalm 104, if you go over there and look, he starts off in verse 1. Bless the Lord, O my soul. O Lord my God, you are very great. You are clothed with splendor and majesty. And he talks about the creation. He talks about laying the beam of his chambers on the water in verse 3. He makes the clouds his chariot. And then he goes in verse 5. He sets the earth on its foundation so that it could never be moved. Okay, so the earth is going to be permanent and fixed, and no matter what happens, it's not going anywhere. Then in verse 6, you covered it with the deep as with a garment. The waters stood above the mountains. At your rebuke they fled. The sound of the thunder they took to the fly. The mountains rose, the valleys sank down. Obviously, that's poetic language. The idea that the flood waters receded, but God destroys the world by flood, and this is not the only place that that's mentioned. It's I didn't write it down, but it's in the notes. In Psalm 29, it's mentioned as well, and I think there are other examples as well. So we see a lot about the flood. What are some other examples? What other stories or whatever um, people we read about in the Psalms? David doesn't count. He wrote the Psalms, or wrote a lot of them, I should say.
Remembrance of the Exodus.
Okay.
Reading from the book here.
Yeah.
He says in 66, 68, 114, 135, and 136, there are elements of the Exodus coming out of Egypt.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there's a lot about the Exodus and different aspects of the Exodus, right? Whether it be Israel's bondage, whether it be the plagues themselves, whether it be God delivering Israel from the land, bringing them through the Red Sea. The Red Sea is mentioned in a couple of different Psalms, 78 and 136, and just the idea of deliverance from Egypt. What else? What are some other examples? We're kind of moving through the history here.
The wilderness wandering.
Okay, you got the wilderness wandering, bringing them to Mount Sinai, and again the story of God's faithfulness, and it's punctuated by Israel's unfaithfulness, their rebellion, and yet in all this, not only does God forgive them and have mercy on them, but He takes care of them. He guides them through the wilderness. He's shown as their protector. He's shown as their leader, their king, their provider in all these things. And of course, again, interspersed in there is the rebellion of the people as well. And of course, finally, that brings them into the promised land. And we see the capture, the conquest of Canaan, all the way through, as he talks about in Psalm 137, where God takes all of it away from them because of their ungodliness, because of their idolatry. Eventually, the Babylonians come in, destroy the city, destroy everything that they have, take them off into exile. And we see in Psalm 137 the psalm of mourning that was written in the wake of that. So,
But then there's the rejoicing psalm. Come home.
mhm. Yeah, there's always that theme of restoration, the idea of God's blessings, man's rebellion, God's call to repentance or His punishment, man's repentance, and God reconciling, restoring that relationship. So you see that pattern. It's just the wash, rinse, and repeat over and over again throughout the course of the book. As we think about this, we talk about the creation and what we learn from the creation. I mean, when I read the accounts of the creation, what do I come away with in those discussions? Yeah, I mean, that's some of them right there, right? Somebody wants to elaborate on any of those?
It's a creative power,
Okay.
the wisdom that he had,
Hmm.
foreseeing everything that's gonna take place
Hmm.
and preparing.
Yeah. Yeah. Go ahead.
I have a fluffy one that you didn't get.
Okay. Yeah.
The love of God, and that
Okay.
he put everything on it that he thought he needed, and then looked at it and it was missing something.
Okay.
What he chose was a rebellious, faulty people that are going to turn against him again and again and nail Jesus to a cross, but they're still worthy
Hmm.
because some of them will love him.
Yeah. So yeah, he gives us a chance, and he gives us free will. He gives us blessings. Uh, it's fun.
Wisdom in providing a helpmate.
Yeah. The wisdom in providing the
Wasn't what's suitable.
I mentioned, and by the way, it's I always like reading that section. It's the way it's written. It almost seems as if God took. All right, let's go find you a wife. No, the zebras won't work. No, that's not going to work. You always wonder, well, why God clearly knows that's not going to work. Why do they go through this exercise? And
Show him.
yeah, the obvious answer is because Adam needed to understand that. And if we're really getting deep in this, there's obviously just a core biological thing that Adam needed to realize, which is I can't mate with an animal and I can't have kids with an animal, and that's obviously understandable. But beyond that, Adam looks at these animals. What's missing from them? I mean, there's a lot of things obviously that's missing. A soul. Uh, which who's higher on the chain here, Adam or the animals? Adam is. And the idea is that these are not suitable for you because they are below you. They are created for you. You are supposed to be elevated above them. You're not an animal. And the whole creation is God is trying to create you as distinct from animals, and man finds ways throughout the course of Genesis to get himself closer and closer and closer to the point where there's no more distinction. And that's, of course, in our culture, that's kind of where we're going. We're just, any distinction that we have between man and animals is slowly going away.
Well, a lot of documentaries will actually call you one.
Hmm. They'll call you an animal. There's nothing. There's no. We'll talk about there. Well, yeah, there's some differences. We're a lot more sophisticated. Okay, is it really just about sophistication though? I mean, can a soulless animal who just happens to have opposable thumbs, create some of the art and some of the beauty in our world, in our history? Can they create the kind of community and fellowship that we have? We always hear, man, look at the amazing complexity of the society that the great apes have. The, their society is based on violence. It's based on intimidation. It's based on me beating this guy up until he gets his friends together. That's their. We were watching that the other day. The lower chimps kind of get this little go and groom each other and form little bonds, and then they get enough to go beat up the guy that's in charge and chase him off. And that's how they run things. That's the animal way of doing things. And the whole point, all the way through, is God trying to tell man, you're not going to act like that because you were created for something much better than that. And it's a lesson that we fail to learn on a number of examples. Yeah, there's a lot of examples of what we would learn from a creation standpoint. Well, let's walk through. One thing we didn't mention, as people that are mentioned as well, is the story of the patriarchs. We see both. In fact, I think they're going to be mentioned, all three of them, in is it Psalm? Yeah, it's in Psalm 105, and there's a lot in 105. In fact, I'm going to save that for going through at the end because that's kind of, since I'm doing the lesson, I'm going to talk about that a little bit. But you'll notice that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are mentioned throughout this, and it's verse 9. In fact, the covenant that he made with Abraham, his sworn promise to Isaac, which he confirmed to Jacob as a statute, to Israel an everlasting covenant. The idea that working through these three men, God confirmed something and promised something and remembered them. And the significance being, of course, that if God if I make a promise to somebody and he dies tomorrow, Do I really have to fulfill that promise? I guess sometimes you might say, well, you really should, but I don't really have to. And yet God says, no, I am, as Jesus says, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I promised them this. And just because they're gone, that doesn't mean that my word will change, that I will not remain faithful in what I promised. And so there's some fundamental lessons that they're supposed to be learning about that relationship, that God is faithful, even after death, even through death. And so we see those continued blessings that are given in Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and his protection. It reminded me of, if you've been reading Genesis, uh, you're right. Each one of the men, at some point, in fact, look over in Genesis 22. In fact, there's a quote. Is it in? I thought
You're not giving me enough information to help you.
I know. Yeah, there it is. It's in Psalm 105. He's talking about in verse 12. He says, "When they were few in number," of
Where?
Psalm 105, verse 12.
You're supposed to go to Genesis.
I know, but I'm going to set the stage for that. Sorry, in 105 verse 12, where he says, "When they are few in number, of little account, and sojourners in it." And that's Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, right? That's the people sojourning, wandering from nation to nation, from one kingdom to another people. He allowed no one to oppress them. He rebuked kings on their account, saying, "Touch not my anointed ones, do my prophets no harm." Does that remind you of anything that we've been reading the last month in Genesis? Yeah, like what?
Abimelech.
Yeah, the story of Abimelech, 2 times over, right? That happens twice with Abraham and also with Isaac. Of course, it was a different Abimelech, but that Abimelech was most likely a title. Um,
No, it was the same guy.
yeah. So we're seeing that idea. In fact, if you remember when it's Abraham involved and Abimelech has the vision from God, it says, "Why are why have you got Abraham's wife?" He said, "Look, I didn't know anything. I haven't done anything." He said, I know you haven't, but you need to make sure that you don't touch him, because if you do, I'm going to curse your entire household. Now go to Abraham and offer, have him offer sacrifices, because he is a prophet. He's called a prophet in there in that example. And then we have Isaac and Jacob. There's an interesting story, by the way. And so now, if you're over in Genesis, go on over to chapter 20. There's 21, but I want to look at 26, because this one is interesting, and I hadn't picked up on it before. In Genesis 26, this is Jacob. Isaac, and of course, Isaac has the same issue that Abraham has. They both go through the same deal in the land of the Philistines. But Jacob is one that I sometimes miss. If you remember the story, this is another one of those, why is this story here? If you remember, in chapter 34, I'm sorry, I said 26, but let's move over to 34. I'm thinking of 35. Genesis 30, Genesis 34. Remember the story of Dinah? The story of Dinah, Jacob's daughter, through Leah, and she is raped by one of the men in Canaan. And long story short, Simeon and Levi decide to get revenge, and Jacob, right or wrong, it's kind of let this slide a little bit. But now, when they've killed all the men in the city, he tells them, down in verse 30, "You have brought trouble on me by making me stink to the inhabitants of the land, the Canaanites and the Perizzites. My numbers are few, and if they gather themselves against me and attack me, I shall be destroyed, both I and my household." But they said, should he treat our sister like a prostitute? Now, it's one of those questions where you think, well, should Jacob have? I've wrestled with this a lot. Well, was Jacob right or wrong? Were the brothers out of line? Was Jacob right in telling them, look, you've gone too far with this? But what's ultimately the issue here? Jacob is afraid for his life because of the unrighteousness of the people around about him, which, by the way, is exactly what Abraham feared when he went in with Abimelech. And it's the same thing with Isaac. But notice what the very next story in chapter 35 says. God says to Jacob, "Arise, go up to Bethel and dwell there. Make an altar there to the God who appeared to you when you fled from your brother Esau." So Jacob said to his household and to all who were with them, "Put away the foreign gods that are among you, purify yourself, and change your garments. Then let us arise and go up to Bethel, so that I may make there an altar to the God who answered me in the day of my distress and has been with me wherever I've gone." What already resonates with you about this, based on what the last thing that he said in chapter 34 was? What? What's the last thing Jacob says in chapter 34?
Should you treat your sister like a prophet?
Well, that was his sons. What did Jacob say? No, that was the sons. Keep going back. That's not Jacob. What did Jacob say?
Even if they gather themselves against me and attack me, I shall be destroyed. Will die in my house.
All right, what's Jacob already forgotten?
God is in control.
That God's with him. That God has promised to take care of him. And that the actions of his sons, who, quite frankly, were justified in what they did to some degree at least, maybe they went overboard, but and maybe they were deceitful and dishonest about what they were doing. I feel like there's a whole lesson in chapter 34, and maybe one of these days I'll put it together, but not this week. Um,
God.
yeah, yeah, that shouldn't have happened, and maybe that's part of the problem. But this is where, if you remember, Rachel had stolen the household idols from Laban on the way out, because they were still holding on to these, and maybe Jacob tolerated it for a while, and finally said, "Well, God has said, come to Bethel and altar. We need to get serious about this." And he reminds himself, even he's forced to remember in his own mind, who answers me in the day of my distress and has been with me wherever I have gone. And notice what it says in verse 4. So it gave they gave Jacob the foreign gods they had, and they go on. It says in verse 5, as they journeyed, a terror from God fell upon the cities that were around them, so that they did not pursue the sons of Jacob. In other words, all that fear, all that worry, well, God's with you. And so we see that protection that's there, that assurance that if you will follow God, if you will put your trust in God, again, put away your household idols and serve the Lord, this is the protection he's going to offer. And that's the assurance that they've been given. And it's always in the context that if the patriarchs had the same assurance, how much more the people through whom that God has called to bring out of them, that God has promised to bless on their behalf, because he's still honoring that promise. So they see that they have that assurance. We get into the journeying to Egypt. And if you're thinking about that, some of the same things that we would learn from that, but what are some of the lessons that we get from the Psalms about the journey to Egypt? Now, this is the journey to Egypt, not the journey from Egypt.
The journey that Joseph took to Egypt.
Yeah.
Oh,
Well, there's two journeys really. There's Joseph's journey, but there's also the people's journey, right? Hmm. Yeah. Theirs was by choice, although you could argue it wasn't really by choice. But Joseph, on the other hand, Joseph didn't have a choice in the journey. But why did Joseph? Why in the end? Why did Joseph ultimately go down to Egypt? Because God planned it that way, and God used the sin of his brothers to bring it about. And again, the idea that even going into captivity has value when it is done according to God's plan. It's not pleasant at the time. I can't remember how many years it was. He was 13 years in Egypt before he eventually became second under Pharaoh. So 13 years of bondage to some degree or another in a foreign land with no friends, no support, cut off from everything. And yet the whole time God was with him. Mhm. Yeah. Hmm.
He was preparing to supply
Yeah.
those that were going to need
it. And even beyond that, what's amazing about it is that we think about the story of Israel and really the story of Christ, and how all of these things are taking place. And to do that, God's people need to be taken out of Egypt. And so they need to be brought down. And so all the things that have to go in place, and God, in the process of that, makes sure that everything is in place so that when his people do go down to go down to Egypt, they'll be taken care of. And they will be prepared for a time when they will be brought out stronger, more numerous, and theoretically ready to do what God has called them to do, ready to be the nation that He's called them to be. Yeah, no, nobody. I can't even plan. We're talking. Do you want to go Friday? Do you want to go Friday night to the singing at Westside? Yeah, I'd like to. Let's see how it goes. What's going to happen between now and then? I don't know. Lord willing, we'll try to go. But yeah, as Jesus said, sufficient is the trouble from today without worrying about tomorrow. God plans generations ahead. God plans without limits in respect to time. And we see, again, as we see the story, and the more we study the Old Testament, the more we see that plan laid out for us. Almost as if, almost the way that God sees it. You know, God is looking at time and looking at all this spread out and saying, all right, I want this to happen here, and I'm going to bring this about in the fullness of time, and I want everything to be set up to where it's exactly then. And so in looking back, we can see the mind of God in a very limited way. So, you know, it's a great encouragement for us. At least it should be. Yeah. Hmm. And what that will be like, I can't even imagine. I guess there's only one way to find out, and that's to go. So we have the journey down to Egypt. Again, that idea of provision to fulfill the promise, and now, of course, we've got the journey out of Egypt, uh, all of which was brought about,
Slavery.
yeah, 400 years later. Again, because God works on His own timeline. But He has to give time to do a number of things. Israel has to grow numerous, so numerous, in fact, where is it? It was interesting in verse 25 of Psalm 105, as you're reading through there. I'm probably borrowing from my lesson, but that's fine. Psalm 105, where it says in verse 25 that in fact, 24, let's back up. It says, the Lord made His people very fruitful and made them stronger than their foes. He turned their hearts to hate His people, to deal craftily with His servants. Why do you do that? To get them to leave, right? If everything is wonderful, they're not going to want to leave. But it's kind of interesting. It says that God turned their hearts to hate His people. How did He do that? Did God force the Egyptians to hate Israel? Why did the Egyptians hate Israel? I don't- Well, there was that maybe, but He tells you right here, doesn't He? They were numerous. They grew. They were clearly strong. They were fruitful. They were successful. They did well. People hated that. They grew resentful. Did God turn their hearts? No, what God did was they became a threat, and God blessed them to the point where people saw them as a threat. You know, God didn't have to physically or magically or whatever way you want to say supernaturally change people's disposition. People being who they are changed their own disposition, but God brought about the circumstances that caused that to happen. It's a great example of showing how God turns the hearts of men and how God works His will. And in this case, basically blessing Israel until the Egyptians are fed up and create a situation where now they're going to be ready to be delivered out of bondage.
Verse 38 of Psalm 105. Egypt was glad when they departed, for the dread of them had gone.
Mhm. And of course, the dread being the 10 plagues that he enumerates from verse 26 on down through verse 36, just describing punch after punch, blow after blow, plague after plague, of until Egypt is just ready to get rid of these people. And so he brings them out, verse 27, with silver and gold, and there was none among the tribe who stumbled. As you said, Israel was glad when they departed, for dread of them had fallen upon them. In other words, a nation of people that had been enslaved is now turned into something that strikes fear into the heart of the most powerful nation in the world. So much so that they said, get out of our country. All of this because God had blessed His people and because God had put everything in motion to bring those things about.
That way. All the scientists always want to say that there's no evidence that this mass of people
Mhm.
they that much because they were larger than them and stronger than them.
Mhm.
I don't want to mention it either.
Yeah, there's a lot of reasons why if 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 my armies were supernaturally wiped out by a bunch of people that I consider to be inferior to me, then I might not particularly care to include that. And again, that doesn't mean that it isn't there somewhere. Like we always, whenever I talk to Luke Chandler, we always say the same thing. Just because we haven't found it doesn't mean it's not there, or just because we haven't found it doesn't mean it wasn't written down at some point and it's just been lost or destroyed at some point. So uh, but yeah, you're right. There's not always a motivation like we always talk about, where it says that Sennacherib in his records talks about having pinned King Hezekiah up in his city like a bird in a cage. It doesn't say why he didn't take the city though. He doesn't bother to write that part down. Of course, we know because the Bible tells us that his army was wiped out. But he doesn't include that part of the story because it doesn't glorify him. So that's a good point. So we got the journey to Egypt. We come next to the wilderness wanderings, and of course I think we can probably understand a lot of the messages that are there, the things that we learn out of that. and the continued stories, and he'll bring this up a lot in in Psalm chapter 106 or Psalm 106, where he accounts the blessings of Israel and God's patience with them despite their continued baffling sometimes rebellion. I just went through and looked at the number of times that he lists and the number of ways that Israel rebelled in this time. He mentions, okay, um, he starts off in verse 6 and says, both we and our fathers have sinned. We committed iniquity. We've done wickedness. So and he kind of sets the stage. We were in Egypt, didn't remember the abundance of your steadfast love, and rebelled at the sea, and we were ready to turn back there, and God helped us there. But verse 13, they soon forgot his works. They had wanton cravings in the wilderness. In other words, why don't you give us, uh, we're sick of this manna, give us quail, give us all, we wish we had all the stuff we had back in Egypt. Talks verse 16, the men in the camp were jealous of Moses and Aaron, and so they rebelled. Then we've got the calf in Horeb and verse 19, and worshipped a metal image. Verse 24, they despised the pleasant land. In other words, we get all the way up to Canaan, and finally now we just don't want to go in at all. And so they were constantly rebelling. And yet through all this, he describes this idea of God being willing to stay with them. Verse 44 says, nevertheless, he looked upon their distress when he heard their cry. For their sake, he remembered his covenant and relented according to the abundance of his steadfast love. He caused them to be pitied by all those who held them captive. As you're reading this as a Jew during the time of the exile, and you're thinking to yourself, is God ever going to restore us? Is God ever going to bring us back? And I read Psalm 106. Look at why would he stop now? He's taken us back over and over again when we've come back, when we've cried out for mercy. He has restored us time and again. Why not now? And so we see that pattern. And in verse 47, he kind of sums it up. Save us, O Lord our God, and gather us from among the nations. That's the language of exiles right there, isn't it? Gather us back together. Bring us back where we used to be. So we've got the wilderness wanderings. Finally, we get to the conquest of Canaan. And of course, there's all kinds of lessons that we get from the conquest of Canaan, right? Among which, what are some of the things that you would pull out of that?
Well, with Jericho,
Okay.
with Jericho and Ai, and then they start breaking it up.
Mm-hmm.
So it's the granting of his promise.
Yeah, it's God doing exactly what he said he's going to do. And when was the time that things didn't go well? When they didn't do what they said, when they didn't do what he said, when they doubted his word, when they didn't believe him, when they didn't trust him, and when they weren't willing to go in and actually do the work. Because ultimately, did they take the land? Yeah. Did they really? But did they do everything God told them to do? No, they didn't drive the people out. They didn't get rid of the gods. All you got to do is read the book of Judges, and you start to realize that really what they did, more than anything, more than bringing a new law into the land, they kind of merged themselves with the people around them. And and I think one of the main points to take away out of the book of Judges is by the time we get to this horrific story of the Benjaminites who do exactly what Sodom and Gomorrah did back in Genesis. And we think, well, why are we reading this story? It's because after a few years in Canaan, Israel has digressed all the way back to what the people in the land were doing. The things that got those people driven out of the land. Israel was no better. Yeah, Israel was no better. And so, we see that failure and that unwillingness to follow God and to be faithful as God has been faithful. But when they were able to do all that God promised that they would be able to do. And of course, through all this, we see God's wrath and then God's mercy through His people. And I guess let's see, we got about 15 minutes left. Let's see if there's any other questions that we want to talk about. Oh yeah, this is the next page is the questions. Let's see, we talked about that. One of the questions I thought was pretty good. Verse 4. Well, actually, verse 4, question 4. Well, let's do question 3 first, if you had a chance to do it. Mount Sinai in question 3 is a place in the southern Sinai Peninsula in present-day Egypt. But when you think of this place, what are some of the thoughts that first rush to your mind? When you think of Mount Sinai, what do you think of? Ten Commandments, the law. What else?
It's kind of a mountain in the middle of the desert.
Okay. Well, I mean, it is in the middle of the desert. I was wondering whether it's just a big solitary mountain. Having been in that region, although we were probably well north of where that was, but there weren't a lot of solitary mountains. It was basically mountain ranges, and so I assume that Mount Sinai was probably maybe the peak of one of those mountains, maybe the tallest or something along those lines. But the burning bush, which happened there, there's a lot of things. Well, there's a lot of things that happened at Mount Sinai, right?
Golden calf.
The golden calf. Uh, it's the mountain shaking, the mountain completely engulfed in flame. You know, the sign of it's amazing, the sign of God's greatest uh, manifestation of His holiness and man's greatest example of their ungodliness, right in the same place, in almost the same time. It's quite the contrast. But you see, all these great things, and Sinai keeps coming back into play. If you remember, that's where Elijah goes back when he's despairing of his life, and basically God, it's almost like God reboots him. He brings him all the way back to Sinai and we start over, and that's kind of what happens. Um, and there's even a similar scene with Moses and Elijah, where Moses wants God to reveal Himself to him, and God places him in the cleft of the rock and hides him with His hand. That's where we get the song, and passes before him and shows him His glory. Elijah comes and essentially something very similar happens to that, right? He's just I don't know what else to do. I'm alone. I'm no better than my fathers, and God takes him and speaks to him and shows him His power and then says, "All right, now that you've seen who I am, go do what I told you to do." And so, Sinai becomes just the central point in really all of the aside from Jerusalem, Mount Sinai is probably the central location in all of the Old Testament. Um, Talked about 6 things. I'm gonna let's skip forward here for a little bit. I thought this was kind of interesting. I kind of expanded on his question. He asked 6 things that occurred during the wilderness wanderings of Israel. And it occurred to me that I can break that up into 3 and I can find 6 of 3 different things. You can find 3 probably can find more than that. 6 examples of blessings that God gave to the people. 6 examples of God manifesting His power and His God and His divinity, and 6 examples of Israel's rebellion against God. So you don't have to answer it that way, but I kind of broke it out that way. But if you have to think of 6 things in the wilderness, 6 examples of stories.
What blessings?
Well, yeah, let's start with that. Blessings. 6 blessings that God gave the people: food, shelter,
Um,
clothes didn't wear out, light, guidance, right? The pillar of fire, the cloud, the law. That's pretty much a law given.
Angel guiding them.
Yeah, the angel guiding them. I had this. I had the Sabbath day established, which was a blessing. It was a day of rest. But yeah, you had the manna, you had the water, you had the quail, provision and guidance, as you said. Their clothes never wore out. God was, in ways that they probably. I'm not sure that I would have noticed that.
And they obviously didn't.
Yeah, until at some point, and Moses had to point out, your shoes never wore out. Really? Yeah, I was like, I just thought they were really good shoes. But after 40 years, that's just the things that you take for granted, and then you look back and go, "Well, God really was with us." Maybe that's a great example. That's another example today of how the things that we just take for granted, and we look back and notice, you know what? God's done a lot more for me than I realized that I just didn't notice. All right, so 6 exhibitions of power.
The show on the mountain.
Okay, the fire, yeah, fire on the mountain.
The fire.
Yeah, the display, right?
Yeah. I would say the brazen serpent is part of
The
it.
serpent would be a good example, yeah.
The pillar of fire and pillar of cloud.
Pillar of fire, parting the Red Sea, parting the Jordan. Both would work. Let's see, I had the Red Sea, fire on Sinai, the pillar of fire and cloud, defeating of Moab. There were a couple of different military victories that took place. The defeating of Korah, The rebellion where they were basically swallowed up into the earth, if you remember. We have the crossing the Jordan on the other side. It's 6 lapses of faith, 6 times where Israel failed. There probably were more than 6. Yeah. You want to get at the Red Sea. We want to go back. We're in trouble. We're hungry. We're thirsty.
We're still hungry.
Still hungry, still thirsty. That happened a lot.
Yeah. You have no right to be married to that Cushite woman.
Yeah, the rebellion of Miriam and Aaron. Yeah, you had the golden calf, obviously. You got the complaints over water. We don't have enough water. Where's the water? Complaint. And by the way, you know,
That different.
yeah, having been there, and you can imagine what it is. I'm sure that in your mind you can imagine what Israel was like. It's not like if I'm walking in the wilderness for 2 days in Israel and I'm looking around, I'm wondering where the water is too. Uh, and it occurs to me that maybe the problem was not so much that they were worried about not having well, the problem was not so much that they wanted water. It's the problem was that they went right from God send us they skipped right over the God, could you send us some water to God, why aren't you giving us water? Why'd you bring us out here to die? There's no consideration that maybe if we just asked. And I always wonder about that. If they'd said, God, would you please send us water? Here's your water. I suspect he would have. But instead, why did you bring me out to die? It's like a child would act. You brought me out to die in the wilderness without any water at all. Like, there's water right over there. Didn't you just ask for it? um, the rebellion of Miriam and Aaron, the rebellion of Korah, the refusal to enter the land, the rebellion of the spies. And then to tack that on, I always love the part, well, I don't love it, but the part where Moses says, all right, you rebelled back into the wilderness. We're all going back and you're all going to die. And all of a sudden, no, okay, it's okay. We'll go now. No, it's too late now. God's already made the ruling. You made your decision. Said, no, we'll go anyway. It'll be fine. And of course, they go in and they're defeated soundly because God's not with them. Yeah, it's not hard to find the 6 lapses of faith. You could have included as well the time when Balaam convinced them to sin with the idolatry towards the end. There's any number of examples where all this happened. Um, I did want to walk us through something that I thought was kind of interesting in Psalm. I'll try to go quickly because I know we don't have a lot of time left. But when you're looking in this, I'm very curious if the other books will line up this way, and I'll acknowledge that this is a loose uh, chain of thoughts in Book 4, which starts in Psalm 90. But it's something that's just kind of worth noting that you'll start to see some themes. We mentioned that if you remember, Book 3 ends in Psalm 89 with a call for God to reconcile. When he says in verse 40, how long, O Lord, will you hide yourself forever? How long will your wrath burn like fire? Remember how short my time is. For what vanity you've created all the children of man. That idea of wanting to find, he says, where is your steadfast love of old in verse 49? Wanting to restore that relationship. And book 4 starts with a prayer of Moses. And if you'll notice, it seems to me at least that there's a higher concentration of discussions of this history of Israel in book 4. Maybe it's just because it's just more condensed. But it starts off all the way back with a prayer from Moses. And he starts off by saying, Lord, you have been our dwelling place in all generations. You have been our dwelling. We have dwelt in you. You've been our security. And you'll notice through a lot of these Psalms, that idea of refuge, that idea of dwelling in God and being in God's presence keeps coming up. And he talks about um, how they've stumbled, they've fallen away, and they've come back. And so finally, he calls for humility and says in verse 12, teach us to number our days that we may get a heart of wisdom. And it occurs to me that a lot of what you see in this book, in book 4, is a call to wisdom. It's pointing them back to reminding them of what things were like when their relationship with God was good, all that God had done for them, showing them how things went badly and what happened when they turned back to God. And the idea of being humble before God and remembering who God is. In Psalm 91, where he starts by saying, he who dwells in the shelter of the Most High will abide in the shadow of the Almighty. I will say to the Lord, my refuge and my fortress, and my God in whom I trust. That's really what he's trying to establish in this particular psalm. And I think the psalmist, as he's building through all of these, makes this point. By the way, this is the passage where he talks about in verse 11, for he will command his angels concerning you to guard you in all your ways. On their hand they will bear you up lest you strike your foot against the stone. This is the passage that Satan quotes to Jesus. So you can jump off the temple and God will make sure nothing really happens to you. And obviously it's not talking about a literal thing, but it's the idea that that's the kind of trust you ought to have in God. And he goes and describes all the things that he has done and why we should trust in God in verse 92. How great are your works, O Lord. Your thoughts are very deep. The stupid man cannot know, the fool cannot understand. But he describes the idea of who God is and how God blesses the righteous. It is in verse 6 of Psalm 92. And so he talks about the idea that in verse 12, the righteous flourish like a palm tree and grow like a cedar in Lebanon, planted in the house of the Lord. They flourish in the courts of our God. Again, that's that idea of dwelling in the Lord. It comes back again. And so he's describing in Psalm 93 that the Lord is reigning, his throne is established, the world is established, it'll never be moved. This idea of the eternal nature of God that's being brought up. He goes into chapter 90, or Psalm 94, and describes and reminds them of the faithfulness and the long suffering of God. The idea that God is there, He's been eternally there, He is wise, and again in verse 8, understand, O dullest of the people, fools, when will you be wise? And so he says in verse 10, he who teaches man knowledge, the Lord knows the thoughts of man, that they are but a breath. In other words, in verse 12, blessed is the man who you discipline, O Lord, and whom you teach out of your law. The idea of being humble and seeking instruction from God and trying to learn from this relationship and what we have seen and what God has done. And so he goes into 95 and talks about praising God and trying to have an attitude of worship and humility. He says in verse 8 of Psalm 95, do not harden your hearts as in Meribah, as in the day at Massah in the wilderness when your fathers put me to the test. Don't harden yourself. Don't be like the people where he says in verse 10, for 40 years I loathed that generation. And they said, there are people who go astray in their heart. They have not known my ways. Therefore I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter my rest. And so in chapter 96, he goes back into worship and says, sing to the Lord a new song, and declaring his glory in verse 3 among the nations, and ascribe to him glory and honor, and praising him, saying in verse 10, the Lord reigns. Yes, the world is established, it shall never be moved. He will judge the people with equity. And he even calls the heavens and earth to be glad and to rejoice in verse 11. And describing God not only as the creator of the world, but the judge of the world, and judging in righteousness and faithfulness. And so he comes down and starts to describe the power of God and the majesty of God in his creation in verse 97, and calls the people to make a praise in 98, a joyful noise to the Lord. Again, calling the creation itself in verse 7, let the sea roar, let the rivers clap in verse 8 before the Lord, for he comes to judge the earth. He will judge the world with righteousness and the people with equity. And so he starts emphasizing in 99 the idea that the Lord is reigning. He's enthroned in Zion, and he is to be praised because he is a king. As he says in verse 4, it's not just that he's powerful, but that he loves justice. He's established equity. He has executed justice and righteousness in Jacob, or in Israel. Exalt the Lord your God. And again he goes back to the old law. He says, Moses and Aaron were among his priests. Samuel also among those who called upon his name. And he noticed, by the way, in verse 8, he says, Lord our God, you answered them, but you were a forgiving God to them, but an avenger of their wrongdoings. In other words, you forgave them, but you also didn't let them off the hook when they sinned. These great men who did wrong, and yet you forgave them. And he talks in verse 100 about the steadfast love of the Lord, reminding the people that through all of this, he says in verse 3, know that the Lord, he is God. It's he who made us. We are his people, the sheep of his pasture. And that ought to be cause for rejoicing. And so he brings into Psalm 101 the idea of walking with integrity. When I see these things, when I think, as he says, I will ponder the way that is blameless. Because of my relationship with God, I'm going to try to walk with integrity. He says in verse 3, I will not set before my eyes anything that is worthless. That's a good one. I need to have that pinned on my bulletin board. That's a pretty good one to have. I hate the work of those who fall away. And he describes this idea of wanting to be righteous and seeking to be surround himself with things that pertain to God. And he almost does a switch because in Psalm 102, obviously, now you've been talking about, I love righteousness, I want to do what's good. And now all of a sudden in chapter 102, we're back to hearing my prayer, O Lord. Let my cry come to you. Do not hide your face from me in the day of my distress. And he talks about the idea that even in this relationship, we see distress, we see turmoil, we see difficulty. He says, my days in verse 11 are like an evening shadow. I wither away like grass, but you, O Lord, are enthroned forever. You are remembered throughout all generations. You will arise and have pity on Zion. It is the time to favor her. The appointed time has come. And this is the passage that we read earlier where he goes to verse 18 and says, let this be recorded for generations to come. And the idea being, again, that I'm looking back and seeing what God has done. And we want to record this so that people in future times will look back on how he has blessed me as he blessed those that came before me. And as he says, he talks about the eternal nature of God in verse 26. They will perish, but you will remain. They will wear out like a garment, talking about the foundations of this earth. And then we get into this section, and this is really where the connections I think are stronger. I know there's a little bit of a tenuous connection throughout these first ones, but in Psalm 103, it starts off with the line, bless the Lord, O my soul, and that gets reiterated a couple of times throughout this. But David writes this psalm. It says, "Bless the Lord" in verse 3, who forgives all our who forgets all our iniquities, who heals all your diseases, who redeems your life from the pit, who crowns you with steadfast love and mercy, who satisfies you with good, so that your youth is renewed like the eagles. He does all these different things for you, and he goes through the psalm and talks about all that he does. He blesses us. He calls us to righteousness. He says later, he forgives when we fail in that righteousness. He goes on, he talks about he endures in his steadfast love for us. And he describes all these, finally getting down to again verse 20 where he sums it up again. Bless the Lord, you angels. Bless the Lord, all his hosts. Bless the Lord, all his works. Bless the Lord, O my soul. Everything ought to bless God for all that he has done. And he picks this up in 104. I don't know if David wrote this one as well, but it seems like it goes along with it because he picks it up. Bless the Lord, O my soul. He talks about the majesty and the greatness of God. And now he starts talking about in terms of the creation. We read some of this before, the creation and the recreation in the flood. He describes how the God who flooded the world and destroyed it with water is also the God who sends the rains that nourish the world and gives all the creation everything that it needs. And it's interesting, again, I wish I'd do this whole psalm because it's a great psalm, but as you read it, think about the fact that everything in creation is described as being where it needs to be, doing what it needs to be, and receiving what it needs to receive from God. There's an orderliness about this. Everything is being done as it ought to be done. And as he closes this out in verse 24, and he talks about how manifold are your works, in wisdom have you made them all. The earth is full of your creatures. And again, he describes all these things that all depend on God. And he says in verse 31, may the glory of the Lord endure forever. May the Lord rejoice in his works, who look on the earth and it trembles, who touch the mountains and they smoke. I will sing to the Lord as long as I live. I will sing praises to my God while I have being. And 34, I think, kind of hit home for me a little bit because he says, may my meditation be pleasing to him, for I rejoice in the Lord. If you remember, we talked about meditation not necessarily being a silent thing, but this psalm is his meditation. And having said, everything in creation is doing what it's supposed to do. It's almost like he ends the psalm by saying, may I be doing what I'm supposed to do. May what I have read, may my praise to you, may my assessment of your greatness be acceptable to you, just as everything else in creation is doing exactly what you've established it to do. And again, he closes it out. Bless the Lord, O my soul. Praise the Lord. And I think he continues in, but we're out of time, so I'm going to stop there. Let me stop the recording and then we'll do our invitation song.